Hello, comic creators. Welcome back to the Comics Experience Podcast, the podcast where we talk to you about the business and creative side of being a professional in the comic book industry. My name is Gamal. The gentleman next to me virtually is Andy, and we have several announcements that we would like to make right before we jump into the big show. So, Andy, why don't you start us off with the project that you've been working on for Comics Experience?
Great. Yeah, we have been working on and have just launched the new Comics Experience website. So it's the same web address, comicsexperience.com, or Comic Sex Experience if you prefer. Um, that's the first thing my brothers pointed out when I had a domain name. But yeah, we've just relaunched the site. It's more user friendly. Our courses are completely redesigned, so we've overhauled how we're doing those. They are now learn at your own pace courses, so you can purchase a course, you get access to the videos. Very soon, a version of them is coming out where you will be able to get feedback on homework assignments and things like that. That version is not up yet, though we have a note on the website that if you purchase the current version and then those come out, you can get the upgrade for just the difference of the price. So don't let that stop you. But it's really exciting. We're trying to keep all the things that have made our courses great for folks in the past, keep all of those things, and yet find new ways for new inroads for people to be able to take the courses and use them. We have changed Comics Connection, which Gamal and I have been promoting for a long time, to Comics Experience Community and Community Pro. And we've been overhauling what that means, how many live sessions we're doing. We've been overhauling a lot of the community aspects and just making it a much more vibrant place in terms of really fun discussions and interactions about comics and pop culture, but also with a lot of learning as well for folks that are interested in that. So there's a lot of new stuff going on, but that's the big headline. New website launched, and we'd love for you to check it out.
Yeah, we're going to go into the different major aspects of all the new elements that we are providing in comicsexperience.com as we move along through these podcasts. But we wanted to make sure that the website itself and the new service launched in time for San Diego Comic-Con, which, as you know, if you are in the comic book industry or like to be in the comic book industry, is going to be less than 2 weeks from now, which means everyone has allegedly gotten all of their assignments for panels. Everyone's gotten their pro passes. You by now should have you should have a ticket to get there if you don't live in San Diego, and most of us unfortunately do not. You have to hopefully you already have a place to stay. Everything that you need to actually get there you should have, and you should a lot of the meetings and lunches and dinners and everything else probably should already be set up. So what we're actually talking about in this lesson, because the last podcast, we talked about the financial aspects of attending conventions and kind of like managing those costs. This podcast, we're going to talk about exactly what it is as a comic book professional you want to consider when you are attending conventions. We're going to use San Diego as an example, but I would like to point out before we have any of these discussions that San Diego Comic-Con is probably one of the largest conventions on the planet. So what you may have to do for a convention like San Diego will not necessarily apply if you're doing a local convention in your town or a regional convention or even a national convention, because conventions like San Diego, New York, Angoulême are, Luca, those are different animals, but a lot of the same principles apply. Andy, does that make sense before we start jumping into the details?
That tracks, and you've hit on some things that I think we're going to talk about anyway in terms of setting up your agenda and what you want to do beforehand. But yeah, that's right. San Diego is massive, as is New York. And how you approach different size shows is going to change pretty significantly, I would think.
Yeah, I mean the first thing it's going to change is the cost, but the other thing it's going to change is things in terms of like time and opportunity and things like that. So I'd like to actually go through this in a rather linear fashion, starting with what you need to be doing before the convention shows up, then talk about being in the convention, and then talk about follow up. So, in a convention, in most cases, if you're going to attend as a professional, you have to make the decision about tabling or not tabling, like we talked about in the last podcast. Link will be in the show notes, but you could just access it. Once you make that decision, you have to then fill out all of the paperwork to, either get a professional pass to get in, or to, get a table, or to just get, a general access pass to go in if you don't necessarily need or want a pro pass. Depending on the size of the show and the amount of people who want to go, the lead time on that could be anywhere between 2 weeks and 9 or 10 months. San Diego, I think you have to apply for a pro pass or whatever in the September in the year before the convention. Is that right, Andy? Or is it like later than that?
I don't remember the month, but it's a ways beforehand. And also depending on the size of the convention and how in demand it is, you may apply to get a table, but you may not get one. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so the earlier you get in, that can help. Certainly if you're late, that's not going to help. But yeah, the earlier you can put an application in, if you know you want a table at a show, the better. Some of them are first come, first serve, but a lot of them are not. A lot of them, they go in and they kind of curate. And so you in your application, you kind of have to like make a case for why you, which is always fun.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you have to prove that you deserve to sell comics, which is, it sounds weird, but because they have limited space and they cannot give space to everyone, you may find yourself going up against Joe Quesada and Chris Claremont, and they're going to get tables. And therefore, if there are enough of them, you may not. Once you actually determine if you can get to the in the show and if you actually get a ticket, and we talked about, we're going to talk about panels in a second, but once you actually figure out whether or not you're going to the show, then the actual logistics of attending the show come into play. Getting the whatever transportation you need to get there, getting whatever accommodations you need, whether it's a hotel or Airbnb. I know that for San Diego, there's quite a few hotels around the convention center that offer space to attendees, and that is a process in and of itself to actually get one of those rooms and pay for one of those rooms. Um, I have never, in my experience, been able to get one of those rooms at a price that is not completely unreasonable to the thing. Andy, I don't think you stay at any of the hotels in that whole San Diego complex area.
I do not. So I commute in. I stay further out, and then I've in the past I've rented a car, or I have taken. They've got a few public transit trains, and I can take those in. Those get super crowded.
Mhm.
Um, but that's the only show that well, that's not true. I do that for New York also sometimes, but there's nowhere to stay near the Javits Center, I don't think, in New York. It is a barren wasteland. Actually, it's built up quite a lot in the last couple of years. But anyway, yeah, I do a different thing. I don't stay in a hotel and then just walk across the street. I stay further out and then I commute in, which is a whole other kind of logistical nightmare. Again, on a show that size, if it's a local show, that's not going to be an issue. But yeah, and I'm like, we're 2 weeks out from San Diego Comic Con, and I am behind on where I should be in planning. I've got my panels, I've got all my panelists, I've got them badges. I've set up several meetings, but not all the ones. That's where I'm really behind. Like you were saying, those meetings should be set up by now. They're not fully for me, but I've got a place to stay. I've got transportation figured out. I've got all the, I've built a first draft of all the PowerPoint presentations, but I don't have all my meetings
Mhm.
set yet. So and I feel that pressure. I'm 2 weeks away, and I feel like I'm really behind. Um,
Yeah. And that is going to be a running theme in this discussion. Once the larger the show, the more pressure is going to be, not because you don't want to go to the show, not because the show itself is going to be bad, but there's so much that needs to be done from a professional standpoint that you start to get kind of you start to get in the weeds very quickly. So once you actually figure out where you're going, how you're getting there, where you're staying, then the logistics of whatever it is you're going to be doing needs to be set up. So if you're going to table, all the stuff that needs to go on the table needs to be figured out, like how your table design, your skirts, your if you're selling product, what product are you bringing it with you and how are you paying for that? Are you shipping it ahead of time? Where are you shipping it to? Who's going to set it up? When is it going to get set up? All of those things, which is why we said tabling is a significantly different beast to attending the convention and not tabling. So if you've gotten into a routine and you've done it, several years at a time, then it kind of becomes like rote. But the first time doing it, which is why we suggest regional shows first, you have to kind of get all of those different pieces in place in such a way that when the doors open on convention day, you're all set up. You've got your table, all your merchandise is there. You've got a smile on your face, and it looks like expended no effort in doing all of this. When in fact, it was a monumentally complex task. Once that's done of all of your stuff, then it comes time, depending on why you're going to the show, to look at the panels, to look at the meetings that you may want to have, to look at how you're going to actually spend your time on a day-to-day basis. I know that the larger the show, I actually will list out on my calendar, like every place that I'm supposed to be, who I'm supposed to see, what I'm supposed to do at that place, and how much time it's going to take me to get to the next place, which is a
that's
lot
a
thing
big
that
one for Comic-Con. Yeah.
yeah, which is something that a lot of people do not factor in. If you have a venue where there's 250,000 people potentially going to be, and you have to be on, at 3 o'clock, you're meeting somebody on one side of the convention center, and at 3:30, you're on a panel. Well, it may take you, depending on the day, 40 minutes to get across. Now you're late. So what I try to do, they have maps of the convention center. They have a lot of different resources you could use, but time management in conventions I believe is an overlooked thing that needs to be addressed if you're planning to do a lot of things. Now, when you first start, you may not be on any panels, you may not have any meetings set up, so it may just be a kind of learning experience and taking it all in. But the more you're there and the more people you set up to meet, because again, you're setting up these meetings 2, 3 weeks beforehand. I think I started talking to people about San Diego meetings. It had to be like end of May, beginning of June. And
Yeah, that sounds right.
yeah, and it's a chicken and egg thing because everybody submitted their panels, but they don't know which panels they have. So they want to meet you, but they don't know if they can. So they say, well, yes, but. So I have a whole list of like the yes, but people. Um, and what usually happens, and Andy, you probably have a lot of experience in this. You either meet people in passing because you're running to something and then they're running to something, but you already know them and you really wanted to talk to them, but you're hopefully walking the same direction, maybe you can talk for 3 minutes there, or you will meet them at one of the various events that happen after the show floor closes, which we will get into in a minute. Has that been your experience over the past quarter of a century?
Yeah, that all tracks. The one thing that I have started trying to add, yeah, I do like you do. I make calendar events, right? And I try to plan travel time between them. And for a show like San Diego that I've been to, with the exception of the COVID year, I've been to every time for I think it is about 25 years now. Coming up 20 years for me. But I know that venue. I even know a lot of the other hotels where a
Mhm.
lot of meetings will take place and all that sort of stuff. So I've got a pretty good handle on how long it takes to get from point A to point B. But I will try and schedule if I can. Like if I'm going to be at the Marriott for one meeting, I may try and schedule one or two other meetings at the Marriott around that,
Mhm.
so that I don't spend more than half of my time walking from hotels to the convention center to another hotel to a different hotel, blah blah, that sort of thing. So I do that. As you go to shows and you start to get to know the area, the venue and the area around it, that gets easier as you do it. um, the other thing I do is, I'll put who I'm meeting, what the meeting's about, tentatively, where I'm meeting them, and then if I can get it, and there are some people that it's easy to get their contact info for, but like I try to
Mhm.
get a cell phone number because it is amazing how many of those meetings won't happen. So I give them my number so they can let me know if
Mhm.
they're going to be late. They probably will be, and I can let them know if I'm going to be late. And often what will happen is the meeting doesn't happen, and then you wind up right where Gamal left off, which is meeting at some event after hours or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, there
So
are.
a lot of things change on the fly. It's basically what I'm getting
Yes.
at.
And there's a thing that I think a lot of people, especially, or even like veterans who've done this for years, they leave out the time period, not just the time period for travel, but the time period for sustenance.
Yeah, and chance encounters,
Yes.
which you kind of mentioned. Yeah.
Chance encounters are a huge thing that can actually be more lucrative and beneficial than the actual meeting, but those things still take time, which means the meeting you had scheduled, you may be late for because you had a chance encounter with someone that you didn't have a meeting set up with. And now the all of the meticulous planning in your schedule has gone out the window because now you're just late forever. Um,
Yep.
but you have to remember to eat. You have to remember to, I don't know,
Water's a big thing.
hydrate. You have
Yeah.
to remember, because I've seen it and I've done it. You go 8, 9, 10 hours running from place to place, being on panels, watching panels, talking to people, doing whatever. And then it's like, wait, it's 10 p.m. and I haven't had breakfast. So don't do that because it's not sustainable long term. And B, it's not helpful to you or anybody else. So what I do try to do when I'm planning meetings is a meeting will be a lunch meeting. So at least if I'm talking to someone, there is food, or it'll be the dinner, or it'll be BarCon, or it'll be something else. If you are tabling and you are pretty much going to be at your table, again, we talked before about having sharing the table and being able to actually leave the table. But if you're stuck there the whole day, you still have to remember to eat, because if you can't leave the booth, then you don't want to be there 12 hours and not have any food. It doesn't make sense. Um, and if you're tabling and you're stuck there the whole time, the best place to plan meetings or to actually engage with the professional community is going to be after the show floor closes, after you've actually reconciled all of your cash and all those other things, secured your inventory, secured your earnings for the day. Then you go out and hobnob with the rich and famous. Well, kind of not so rich and not really that famous. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of actually being there is the panels. If you are on a panel, that is a way, if you are not able to get a professional badge or you are not able to get tickets because of how hard it is to get tickets. If you're on a panel, almost invariably there is a pass that you get. So again, setting up meetings with people beforehand, attempting to be on panels with people beforehand can be very helpful, both in interacting with the professional community, getting into the show, in talking to your potential collaborators, talking to your potential fan base. There's a lot of benefits that come with the panels. What you don't want to do, which I've also done many times to my detriment, is overbook the panels. I mean, I'm thinking the max, just for my personal stamina, is probably two a day. Don't do more than two a day. Otherwise, it all goes sideways. Like last year I did, it was like nine, and that was dumb. Just not, it's not a good idea. Um,
Yeah, the most I've done was 7 over 4 days, and that was doable. I did it, but it was a lot. It was
yeah,
very tiring. Yeah,
yeah, and
and all
it's
the other stuff. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, and it's always a trade off. If you're doing that many panels, that's X number of meetings you're not having with potential collaborators or publishers or distributors or fans or whoever. So balancing that time depending on what your goal is for that particular time frame and what you're working on is something that you need to keep in mind. Now, after the show is over and you have gotten yourself and everything you brought with you back to where you live, I would suggest a certain amount of time to decompress because you've been interacting with people, running around, traveling, probably not eating the most nutritious things that have been put on God's green earth. So you may actually feel a little drained, especially for a show like San Diego. It's not that hard if you're doing, Brooklyn Comic Con and you live in New York. It's like, okay, whatever. But to do a show that big, I would suggest at least a day to kind of let it all out. And then follow up. Follow up is extremely important if you set up potential deals. You talked about working with people. You talked about giving proposals, getting proposals, starting to negotiate contracts, all of those things. The value of Comic Con decreases greatly if you have all those discussions and then you never follow up and nothing ever comes of it. The value increases exponentially, I think, with the follow up and turning those, whether it's a chance meeting, a planned meeting, a panel, anything, turning that into something that gets you into the next step of what your career is going to be. Andy, make sense?
Yeah, that all tracks. One of the things that I do is I get like a small notebook that I can fit in my back pocket,
Mm-hmm.
so that when I have meetings with people that are scheduled or chance encounters, so a lot of times they happen when you're not planning on them. You see people that aren't on your schedule. As soon as I walk away from that meeting, I can pull that booklet out and just jot down a couple of things. Again, who I met with, what it was about, what the follow-up should be about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if I know I already have their contact info, I don't do that. If I don't have their contact info, I try to make sure I get that. And that way I can then, sort of that day you were talking about like decompressing after a big show. Sometimes I just decompress. Other times I decompress, but I also do a lot of work. Like I'll go through everything. Like, you get a lot of handouts and all kinds of stuff. You go through a
Mm-hmm.
lot of that, go through my notebook and sort of organize the post-show game plan, the follow-up game plan. Because the other thing, one of the other mistakes I've made is I got really organized that day, and then like I waited a couple days so that everybody could get back to the office, and then I emailed all of my follow-ups on the same day, and that was a nightmare because I couldn't respond to everybody every day, and like I wound up juggling. So prioritizing them, and also sort of space. If you want, again, this only happens at a really big show, and if you've been there all those days, and this did not start happening for me until I'd been going for quite a while, and I had made a lot of contacts. So once you're at that point, parsing them out so you don't clog your own email box is the way to go.
And I think the final thing before we wrap this up is um, reconciling the financials of the attendance of the show, which means figuring out how, if you were tabling or anything like that, how much money you actually made. If you had to fly there, hotel, food, drinks, whatever, how much you actually spent. And then from a financial standpoint, you can determine the actual profit and loss from that show. Now, anything you spent in the show, if you have a company set up and if you have your taxes set up in the right way, can be a business expense. So it's not just like you threw money down the drain when you bought all of that, fan art and all those graphic novels when you were on the show floor. Um, but to actually understand, if you went as a marketing exercise, well, that's how much you spent on marketing. If you went as, as a sales exercise, that's how much you spent on sales relative to how much you got back. So I think understanding the financials of the show and looking at different shows over time to see which shows are more profitable for you, which shows are less profitable for you, is business intelligence that you can collect on your own kind of endeavors to see what makes more sense for you going forward. Because you may find, and I have quite a few clients who find this, that the big shows are not as lucrative as the smaller shows just because how much they make relative to how much they spend. It makes more sense to go to MegaCon in Orlando if they live in Florida than it does to try to get everything to San Diego, pay for everything, and then realize they made the same amount of money, but they spent twice as much. That makes sense, Andy?
That makes perfect sense. I would also add that part of that cost benefit analysis, if you are trying to do this, as a career or as a second career or second job sort of thing, that, you can call them anything you want, but I'll call them intangibles. But
Mm-hmm.
those are those meetings where like, nope, I didn't get paid to be at that meeting. I didn't get a job necessarily out of that meeting directly. Like
Mm-hmm.
that, my follow-up might not be like, hey, we talked about me writing this thing for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
That may not be the follow-up, but making those connections, those things have value.
Yes.
And for a long, long time, for me, I would fill that schedule up with planned meetings, and it was a chance encounter. Specifically for San Diego, it was a chance encounter that would be the one thing that that led to the biggest payoff. And I really struggled with like, well, how do I factor that into the cost benefit analysis? And eventually I just had to figure it in as, yeah, there's a 50-50 chance that there's nothing I plan for here that is going to pay off as much as something I didn't plan for. So having an idea of intangible things that come out of it that maybe don't lead to specifically to a check, and then the other part of that is how long it takes for those things to
Exactly.
come to fruition. So this wasn't me as a as a writer or as a consultant or whatever, but I had a conversation with a creator about I was editing GI Joe at the time. I was just starting editing GI Joe. I hadn't even launched the books yet, and I had a conversation with a creator, and then like a year later, I think it was. I have my timeline backwards. I was talking to a creator about something else before I was editing GI Joe. Really liked this creator, and then it was 2 years after that I was editing GI Joe, and I called him up,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, "Hey, at Comic-Con, you mentioned that you really like GI Joe and you got a good blah blah blah." Right? He didn't have time to write it, but he was able to bring in another writer who he had met at the same show
Mm-hmm.
that he and I had talked to each other at 2 years earlier. So there's several different pathways that one convention 2 years later paid off into we were all working on a project together. Yeah, it was a really sort of bizarre. Once we put all those puzzle pieces together, we're like, that's a really, you know, coincidental sort of thing. But he had met the other writer at that show. I had met with him at that show. And then all three of us are working on a project together because of our connections at that show 2 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Usually it happens more quickly than 2 years, but I mean, that's what connections are for. That's what networking is about. So yeah, it's hard. I find that the bigger the show, the more meetings you have, the harder it is to do a real cost benefit analysis, but it's worth trying.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at the financials as a piece of it, but like you said, and I've had those experiences as well. It's mine, I think, have been more New York Comic Con just because I've gone more. That you may meet someone 2016 They may become a client in 2018 and they may like blow up in 2021, but there's no way for you to know that in 2016. So
Correct.
to even have the opportunity to do that, you have to kind of put yourself out there and go to the conventions, which is, I think, one of the reasons why so many people go, because you need to start that process. You need to be involved in that community on an in-person level, because a lot of these connections are very difficult, even in the age of, you know, Zoom and social media that we have now, to actually build the things that actually will lead to further steps down in your career. So we're going to not be here for 2 weeks because we're going to San Diego Comic Con. But right after San Diego Comic Con, after we decompress, we will do a show kind of wrap up, I guess, and then start talking about the free events that we're going to have for Comics Experience to give everybody a taste of what it is that that new service is going to be. So if you're going to San Diego Comic Con, then we will probably see you wandering the halls if we're not like running to something already. So until then, I'm Gamal. He's Andy. And have fun with your comics.